Click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this. It all started innocently enough. Mark was just my daughter, Emma's boyfriend. A nice, polite young man who was always respectful when he came by the house. I'd seen them together for a while, but he had never been anything more to me than just Emma's boyfriend. I'd liked him well enough. Thought he was a good influence on her, but I never thought twice about him beyond that. He was part of her world, not mine. But then, one weekend, Emma went out of town for a few days with some friends, leaving Mark behind. I knew he would be around. He practically lived at our house half the time anyway, and I didn't mind. In a way, I was glad he had become so comfortable with us. It meant Emma was in good hands, that he cared about her. So when he offered to help me with some chores around the house, I didn't think much of it. In fact, I appreciated the company. We started in the garden, pulling weeds, clearing out leaves, simple things, but it felt nice to have someone helping. We chatted casually, mostly about Emma and his plans for the future. Mark was easy to talk to, and I found myself enjoying our conversation more than I expected. He had this calm, grounded way about him, and it made me feel at ease. Before I knew it, we had spent hours outside together, laughing and talking as if we were old friends. Afterward, I invited him inside for some lemonade. We sat down in the kitchen, still chatting, and it felt natural. But as we talked, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way he looked at me, the way he laughed at my jokes, the way he'd listen with such focus. It was subtle, but it was there, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. I brushed it off as nothing, just a harmless afternoon, but later that evening I found myself thinking about our time together, and I realized I'd felt different. There was something about Mark that lingered in my mind, and it made me feel both excited and unsettled. He was my daughter's boyfriend, and I knew I had no business thinking about him this way, yet I couldn't shake it. I kept replaying the day in my head, wondering if he'd felt it too, or if I was just reading too much into things. The next day, he came over again, this time to help fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen. Emma had told him about it before she left, and he'd offered to take a look. I tried to keep things casual, to act like everything was normal, but the tension was there, hovering in the air between us, and I could feel it with every glance, every quiet moment. I wasn't sure if he noticed, but I couldn't help myself. The closer he came, the more aware I was of him, his presence, his warmth, the way he moved around me. He finished fixing the faucet, and as he stood up, our eyes met for a moment too long. I felt my heart race, felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in years, and I knew this was dangerous. This was my daughter's boyfriend, and whatever I was feeling, it needed to stop. But standing there, looking into his eyes, I couldn't bring myself to step back. After that moment in the kitchen, I tried to avoid him, or at least to keep my distance. I thought it would help, that if I just focused on other things, this feeling would fade. But Mark kept finding reasons to come around. He'd drop by to check on something for Emma, or bring over some groceries she'd asked for. And every time he came over, I felt that same rush of emotions building up inside me. One evening, a few days later, Mark stopped by unannounced. I was surprised to see him at the door, but I let him in, hoping he'd just be there for a few minutes. He mentioned he had just been out running an errand and thought he'd check in, since Emma was still out of town. I could tell he felt a bit awkward, but he was trying to be polite, to keep things light. We ended up sitting in the living room, chatting. I was doing my best to act normal, to keep the conversation friendly and casual. But there was something different about him that night. He seemed more at ease, almost as if he sensed there was something unspoken between us two. And the longer we talked, the harder it was to ignore. At one point, he leaned back, stretching his arms out along the back of the couch, and I couldn't help but notice how close he was. I felt my heart beating faster, felt the tension that had been building up inside me spill over. It was as if everything around us faded, leaving just the two of us in that small space, caught up in this silent understanding of what we both felt but couldn't say. Mark shifted closer, just a small movement, but it felt like a step across a line. I could feel his presence so close to mine, his arm resting just inches away, and I felt a pull, a magnetic force that was impossible to ignore. I should have said something, should have put an end to it right then, but the words wouldn't come. I was too caught up in the moment, in the electricity that seemed to flow between us. He turned to look at me, his gaze intense and searching, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, that he might break the silence and acknowledge what was happening, but he didn't. Instead, he just watched me, waiting, as if he was looking for permission. I could feel my resolve slipping, my thoughts blurring, and all I could focus on was him, his eyes, his closeness, the warmth that radiated from him. But then, as if some invisible force pulled me back, I realized how wrong this was. This was my daughter's boyfriend, and no matter how strong the pull between us felt, I knew I couldn't do this. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to break the gaze, to look away, and remind myself of the boundaries we were so dangerously close to crossing. The moment passed, but the tension still lingered, heavy and unspoken. I knew he felt it too, that he was as caught up in it as I was, but we both knew it couldn't go any further. I managed a weak smile, excusing myself to get some water, hoping the distance would help clear my head. When I returned, he was sitting up, looking as if he too had been snapped back to reality. I sat down again, this time putting a little more space between us, hoping he'd understand that whatever this was, it couldn't continue. We shared a quiet look, a silent agreement, and I knew he understood. He stayed for a few more minutes, our conversation light but tinged with the knowledge of what had almost happened, and then he left, leaving me alone with the echo of everything that could have been. After that night, things felt different. Mark stopped coming around as often, and when he did, there was a polite distance between us, a shared understanding that we had almost crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I felt a mix of relief and something that felt uncomfortably like regret, knowing we had both pulled back, but also wondering what would have happened if we hadn't. Emma returned from her trip a few days later, and things settled back into a familiar rhythm. Seeing her with Mark was strange at first. They looked so happy together, and watching them laugh and talk, I reminded myself that he belonged with her. I kept telling myself it was a harmless infatuation, a fleeting moment, and I needed to let it go. But letting go wasn't as easy as I'd hoped. I'd catch myself thinking about that night, about how close we had come, and every time I saw him, a spark of that tension would flare up again, reminding me of everything we had almost shared. I knew it was wrong, knew it was dangerous, but those feelings lingered in the back of my mind, a constant, silent temptation. One evening, Emma had invited some friends over, and the house was lively with laughter and conversation. I stayed in the kitchen, keeping myself busy to avoid spending too much time around Mark. But as the evening wore on, I found myself alone for a moment, and before I knew it, he had walked in, grabbing a glass of water and giving me a small, knowing smile. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to stir up everything I'd been trying to bury. I felt the weight of all those unspoken words, all the lingering glances, and I knew he felt it too. We stood there, side by side, neither of us saying a word, but the silence spoke volumes. The pull was still there, undeniable and intense, but we both knew better. We both knew it was something we couldn't act on. Just then, Emma came in, breaking the tension and pulling us both back to reality. She laughed, oblivious, and wrapped her arms around Mark, drawing him into a playful embrace. I watched them together, feeling a pang of guilt and relief, grateful for the reminder of why I needed to keep my distance. As the night wore on, I felt a sense of closure. Mark and I had come close to something neither of us could explain, but it was something that would remain unfulfilled, a secret memory that we'd both carry but never speak of. I'd let it stay as a fleeting moment, something to leave in the past. In the days and weeks that followed, things gradually returned to normal. The distance between Mark and me grew, and I watched him and Emma, happy and carefree, reminding myself that I had made the right choice. It was a chapter that had almost been written, a story that had almost unfolded, but in the end, it remained just that, an almost, and somehow that was enough. Since you enjoyed this video, click on the subscribe button on the screen and check out our channel for more videos like this.